It was the summer of 1969. The golden state of California was basking in the glow of the counterculture era, but beneath the surface of music festivals and peace marches, a shadow was spreading. A name was about to etch itself into history, a name whispered in fear, printed in bold headlines, and remembered for generations: the Zodiac. Just weeks earlier, the Bay Area had been rattled by the murders of David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen on a quiet road in Vallejo. The young couple had been gunned down without warning. The shock still lingered, but for most, life pressed on. Few imagined that the tragedy was not a tragic one-time event, but the beginning of a nightmare. Then, on the night of July 4th, 1969, the killer struck again. At Blue Rock Springs Park, a place where couples often gathered, Darlene Ferrin and Michael Mageau sat in her car under the stars. Their evening was meant to be quiet, maybe even romantic. But just before midnight, a vehicle pulled up beside them. The driver switched off his headlights. At first, it seemed harmless, maybe someone looking for a parking spot. But seconds later, the driver stepped out, and in his hands, a flashlight and a gun. Michael Mageau would later recall the blinding beam of light hitting his eyes. The voice that followed was calm, emotionless. And then, gunfire shattered the silence. The bullets tore through the car. Darlene screamed, Michael panicked, and the chaos unfolded in seconds. Darlene Ferrin was shot multiple times. Michael, though wounded, managed to survive, barely. As the assailant slipped back into the shadows, the young couple's lives were forever changed. Darlene would not survive. Michael would become one of the few people in history to come face to face with the Zodiac Killer and live to tell the tale. But the horror didn't end at the crime scene. Less than an hour later, the Vallejo Police Department's phone rang. The caller's voice was chillingly calm. He said, "I want to report a double murder. If you go 1 mile east on Columbus Parkway to a public park, you'll find the kids in a brown car. They've been shot with a 9mm Luger. I also killed those kids last year." And then the line went dead. The voice was steady, confident, as if he were reporting a routine accident, not cold-blooded murder. Investigators were stunned. The detail about the previous year's murders confirmed that this wasn't a prank. This was the killer himself. Detectives scrambled to the scene. They found Darlene gravely wounded and Michael bleeding from multiple gunshot wounds. The car doors were riddled with bullet holes. Shell casings scattered on the ground told their own story. The killer had used a 9mm handgun, the same weapon type from the Lake Herman Road murders. The Bay Area was no longer safe. A predator was on the loose. And soon, he would tell the world exactly who he claimed to be. Weeks later, the San Francisco Chronicle, the San Francisco Examiner, and the Vallejo Times-Herald each received identical letters. The envelopes bore no return address. Inside, a chilling confession. The writer admitted to both sets of murders. But the letters were not just confessions, they came with something far more sinister. Each letter contained 1/3 of a cryptogram. The message demanded to be printed on the front page of each newspaper. If the papers refused, the writer promised to cruise around all weekend killing lone people in the night, then move on to kill again until I end up with a dozen people over the weekend. It was a chilling ultimatum. The newspapers, working with police, made the decision to print the letters. And with that, the Bay Area was formally introduced to the Zodiac Killer. The cipher itself baffled the public. Rows of strange symbols, circles, triangles, and odd shapes filled the page. The writer claimed the message would reveal his identity. For days, readers pored over the symbols. Amateur codebreakers sat at their kitchen tables, trying to unlock the mystery. Teachers brought copies into classrooms. People obsessed over finding the hidden truth. And then a breakthrough. A schoolteacher named Donald Hardin and his wife, Betty, cracked the cipher within a week. What they uncovered sent shivers down the nation's spine. The message read, "I like killing people because it is so much fun. It is more fun than killing wild game in the forest because man is the most dangerous animal of all. To kill something gives me the most thrilling experience. It is even better than getting your rocks off with a girl. The best part is that when I die I will be reborn in paradise, and all the people I have killed will become my slaves. I will not give you my name because you will try to slow down or stop my collecting of slaves for my afterlife. The letter was more than a confession. It was a manifesto of terror. The writer revealed not only his crimes, but his disturbing worldview. To him, killing was a game, a thrill, and he believed the people he murdered would serve him in the afterlife. The world now knew his name, the Zodiac, a name he gave himself, a symbol he drew at the bottom of each letter, a circle with a cross through it, resembling the crosshairs of a rifle. It was his signature, his brand of fear. With each letter, the symbol would appear again, and each time the terror grew. The Zodiac had stepped out of the shadows. He was no longer just a faceless killer on a lonely road. He was a presence in every newspaper, every household, every whispered conversation after dark. For investigators, the nightmare was only beginning. They now had a suspect who not only killed without remorse, but craved attention. He wanted the world to know he existed. And worse, he promised more violence. As summer turned to fall, the Bay Area braced itself. No one knew when or where the Zodiac would strike next. But everyone knew he wasn't finished. By September of 1969, the unease had spread beyond Vallejo. Parents warned their children not to stay out late. Couples thought twice before pulling onto secluded roads. And police worked tirelessly to track down any lead. Then came Lake Berryessa. On September 27, 1969, Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard decided to spend the day at the lake. It was warm, the sun glimmered on the water, and the hills surrounding them seemed peaceful. They found a quiet spot on a small island near Twin Oak Ridge. They stretched out a blanket, had a picnic, and talked about their future. The afternoon was idyllic, until it wasn't. As the sun began to dip, Cecilia noticed a man approaching. At first, she thought he might be a park ranger. But as he came closer, the sight was chilling. He wore a black executioner-style hood. Over his chest, pinned to his dark clothing, was a white circle with a cross through it, the Zodiac's signature symbol. The man carried a gun. His voice was calm, almost rehearsed, as he told them he needed money and a car to escape from a prison break. He assured them he only wanted to tie them up. But the calm tone couldn't hide the menace behind his words. Brian and Cecilia had little choice. They complied. The Zodiac bound them with pre-cut lengths of plastic clothesline. He double-checked the knots, ensuring there was no chance of escape. Then, without hesitation, he pulled out a long knife. Brian would later recall the sound of the blade cutting through the air. The attack was sudden and brutal. The Zodiac stabbed Brian 6 times in the back. Cecilia was stabbed 10 times as she screamed for help. The horror unfolded in broad daylight, not on a dark road, not in the shadows, but in the open under the California sun. As the killer calmly walked away, he left behind 2 broken bodies. Brian miraculously clung to life. Cecilia, gravely wounded, would not survive. Before leaving, the Zodiac took one more step to ensure his crime would not go unnoticed. On the door of Brian's Volkswagen Carmen Ghia, he scrawled a message with a black marker. Vallejo, December 20th, 68, July 4th, 69, September 27th, 69, 6:30. By knife. It was a list of his murders, a calling card, and it confirmed in his own handwriting that the same man had committed all 3 attacks. Later that evening, the Napa County Sheriff's Office received a call. The voice on the line was calm. The man claimed responsibility for the stabbings and gave directions to the crime scene. When officers traced the call, they found it had been made from a payphone only a few blocks from the sheriff's office. The Zodiac had not only killed again, he had taunted law enforcement right in their own backyard. The Lake Berryessa attack sent shockwaves through California. The brutality, the daylight setting, the hooded costume with its strange symbol. The details were unlike anything the Bay Area had ever seen. This was not a random act of violence. This was staged, planned. The Zodiac was no longer hiding in the dark. He was announcing himself in broad daylight, claiming ownership of his crimes with chilling precision. As news spread, panic deepened. The Zodiac had shattered the illusion that one could be safe anywhere. Lovers' lanes, quiet country roads, even a sunny lakeside picnic spot, all had become potential hunting grounds. Cecilia Shepard fought for her life in a hospital bed. Brian Hartnell, despite his wounds, survived and gave police a detailed description of the attacker's bizarre costume and chilling demeanor. Cecilia, however, would succumb to her injuries just 2 days later. Her death etched yet another name onto the Zodiac's growing list of victims. Detectives now faced a disturbing reality. This killer was escalating. He wasn't content to merely kill. He wanted to terrify. He wanted the world to watch. And he wanted his name, his symbol, to be burned into the public's mind. On October 11, 1969, less than 2 weeks after the Lake Berryessa attack, the Zodiac struck again. This time in San Francisco. Paul Stine, a 29-year-old cab driver, was working his shift in Presidio Heights, a quiet, upscale neighborhood. That evening, he picked up a fare near Union Square. The passenger asked to be taken to Washington and Maple Streets. But for reasons never fully explained, Paul stopped 1 block short, at Washington and Cherry. What happened next would shock the city. At 9:55 p.m., 3 teenagers watched from a nearby window as the passenger leaned over and shot Paul Stine point-blank in the head. They saw the man calmly wipe the cab's interior, as if erasing fingerprints. He then cut away a piece of Stine's shirt, folded it neatly, and tucked it into his pocket, a macabre trophy. The teenagers quickly called police. Officers flooded the area. Within minutes, they spotted a man walking casually away from the scene. But a critical error changed everything. The initial police radio description mistakenly identified the suspect as a black male. The man officers stopped matched much of the description but was white. After a brief exchange, they let him go. Only later would they realize they had almost certainly spoken to the Zodiac Killer himself, and let him walk away. The frustration for police was immense. They had been so close, so painfully close. But once again, the Zodiac had slipped through their fingers. The following day, the San Francisco Chronicle received yet another letter. Inside was a piece of Paul Stine's bloodstained shirt. The killer was confirming his crime in the most gruesome way possible. The letter mocked the police, pointing out that they had missed their chance to capture him. He described the encounter in chilling detail, even boasting that officers had let him pass without question. The letter closed with a new threat. The Zodiac declared he would begin attacking school buses. He described a plan to shoot out the front tire of a bus, then pick off the children as they come bouncing out. It was a horrifying escalation. The thought of children being targeted sent waves of fear through the community. Parents clutched their children tighter. Schools considered adding escorts and heightened security. The Zodiac had found a way to instill fear not just in young couples or lone drivers, but in entire families and neighborhoods. At this point, the Zodiac had become more than a killer. He was a ghost that haunted the entire Bay Area. Every letter he sent was front-page news. Every cryptogram or threat stirred frantic speculation. His words carried weight, not only for law enforcement, but for every parent, every teenager, every commuter who feared they might be his next target. Yet for all his theatrics, investigators still had no clear suspect. There was no definitive fingerprint, no confirmed DNA, no solid lead. Instead, they had eyewitness accounts, a handful of shell casings, some cryptograms, and the killer's own taunting words. And then, in November 1969, came another letter, this time addressed to the San Francisco Chronicle. In it, the Zodiac wrote, This is the Zodiac speaking. Up to the end of October, I have killed 7 people. I have grown rather angry with the police for their telling lies about me. I am not happy to see that I did not get front-page coverage. The letter was accompanied by yet another piece of Paul Stine's shirt. It was undeniable. The Zodiac was still watching, still listening, and still determined to hold the public in his grip. While police scrambled to connect the dots, amateur sleuths began diving deeper into the Zodiac's cryptograms. Some were obsessed, spending sleepless nights trying to decode the killer's words. They hoped that if they cracked enough of his ciphers, they might reveal his identity. But the Zodiac seemed to revel in the attention. He played a game of cat and mouse, sending more letters, more threats, and more puzzles. Each one built his legend further. Each one deepened the sense of fear and helplessness. And while the public puzzled over his symbols, detectives worked the streets. They interviewed witnesses, retraced the victim's final hours, and followed every possible lead. But time and again, they found themselves staring at dead ends. The frustration grew, the fear deepened, and the Zodiac watched it all unfold. As 1969 drew to a close, the Bay Area was a community living under siege. The Zodiac had claimed responsibility for 7 murders. He had taunted police with his words. He had terrified parents with threats against school children. And he had nearly been caught, only to vanish into the night. But one thing was clear. The Zodiac was not finished. And 1970 would bring even more chilling letters, bolder threats, and the growing realization that this was not just a string of murders. It was the beginning of a dark legend that would haunt America for decades. The Zodiac had become a master of fear, not only through his murders but through his words. Letters laced with threats, cryptograms filled with symbols, bloody souvenirs proving his claims. By the dawn of 1970, the Bay Area was gripped by a mix of dread and fascination. The image of the hooded man at Lake Berryessa haunted survivors and investigators alike. The thought of officers unknowingly letting the Zodiac walk past them in Presidio Heights burned in the minds of police. And the cryptic ciphers that newspapers printed continued to stir both terror and obsession. But the Zodiac was far from done. In early 1970, more letters arrived. One contained a diagram of a bomb, supposedly designed to blow up a school bus. The Zodiac claimed he had planted it somewhere in the Bay Area. Panic spread. Parents feared putting their children on buses. Some districts considered halting transportation altogether. Police scoured the city for any sign of explosives, but no bomb was ever found. Had he really built one? Or was it another mind game? The letter's casual cruelty chilled the public. The Zodiac wasn't just threatening lives. He was manipulating an entire city. And in doing so, he showed that he understood the power of fear. Then came another cryptogram. This one, the 340-character cipher, was more complex than his first. Amateur cryptographers and professional codebreakers alike wrestled with its strange arrangement of symbols. It would remain unsolved for over 50 years, finally cracked in 2020 by a team of codebreakers. But back in 1970, its meaning remained a mystery, deepening the Zodiac's mystique. The killer knew that the longer his code went unsolved, the more powerful his legend became. The press played a crucial role in keeping the Zodiac in the spotlight. Each new letter was printed in bold headlines. Radio stations debated his threats on air. Television anchors asked whether the killer was listening to their broadcasts. Some believed the publicity only fueled him, giving him the stage he craved. But others argued that sharing his words might lead to a tip, a break in the case. The Zodiac seemed to enjoy the attention. In one letter, he even chastised newspapers for not putting him on the front page often enough. He was not content with being feared. He demanded to be famous. Meanwhile, detectives followed every possible lead. They investigated dozens of suspects. They collected handwriting samples, compared fingerprints, and re-examined every piece of evidence. But again and again, suspects were cleared. Nothing stuck. The Zodiac remained a phantom. Among the most discussed suspects was a man named Arthur Lee Allen. He was eccentric, had a history of disturbing behavior, and seemed to fit parts of the Zodiac profile. But despite years of suspicion, no conclusive evidence ever tied Allen to the crimes. Like so many leads, it would end in frustration. Through it all, the killer's words continued. One letter read, "I like killing people because it is so much fun." Another declared, "I shall no longer announce to anyone when I commit my murders. They shall look like routine robberies, killings of anger, and a few fake accidents." The arrogance, the cruelty, the sheer confidence of a man who believed he could kill with impunity. And so far, he had. The case took a strange turn in April 1970, when the Zodiac sent a letter to the San Francisco Chronicle addressed to famed attorney Melvin Belli. In it, he pleaded, "Please help me. I cannot remain in control much longer." Was it genuine? A crack in the killer's facade? Or another manipulation? Investigators weren't sure. But the public clung to the idea that maybe the Zodiac was weakening, maybe he could be caught. That hope, however, would soon fade, because the killings and the letters did not stop. By mid-1970, fear had spread far beyond the Bay Area. Stories of the Zodiac appeared across the country. Amateur sleuths traded theories in living rooms and libraries. Some claimed he had killed dozens more than he admitted. Others believed he had ties to other unsolved murders. The possibilities seemed endless, and the uncertainty made him all the more terrifying. Despite the relentless work of detectives, no one had yet been brought to justice. Each new letter felt like a slap in the face to law enforcement. Each new threat renewed the city's sense of dread. As 1970 came to a close, one thing was undeniable. The Zodiac was not just a killer. He was a manipulator, a man who understood that fear could travel farther than bullets, that words could wound just as deeply as weapons, and that as long as he remained unknown, his legend would never die. For the families of the victims, there was only grief. For the police, only frustration. And for the public, an unsettling realization. The Zodiac could be anyone. A stranger on the street, a co-worker, a neighbor, even someone they trusted. His face was a mystery. His name was a riddle. And his hunger for attention seemed insatiable. The Zodiac had made himself immortal, not through life, but through the terror he left behind. And though the murders of Paul Stine, Cecilia Shepard, Betty Lou Jensen, and David Faraday were years behind, their impact would echo for decades. The Zodiac's reign of fear was far from over, because with every letter, every symbol, every threat, he reminded the world that he was still out there, still watching, still waiting, and perhaps still hunting. That ends episode 3. The Zodiac had transformed from a killer in the shadows to a nationwide figure of dread, his taunts leaving scars as deep as his crimes. But as the years rolled on, the mystery only deepened.